Hello and welcome to the most exciting lesson in this entire course, preference settings. I know, this subject couldn't be any more boring. However, this lesson and other ones coming up in this section are the backbone to a fast and productive workflow. The time you spend in this section will pay back many times over by allowing you to increase your productivity, and in the end, you should be able to earn more money. Now, you could skip this lesson and others in this section and move on to the more fun chapters. However, spending 1 hour in this section will save you hundreds, if not thousands of hours over your lifetime use of Photoshop. I highly recommend that you at least go through this section at least once, especially if you want to make a career out of using Photoshop. It doesn't matter if you're a photographer or graphic designer. Once you have the information and have your preferences set up properly, it will allow you to be more productive. You will then have Photoshop working for you instead of you working Photoshop. So if you're ready to get started, let's begin with setting up your Photoshop preferences. Now, like most things in Photoshop, you can either access it through the menu or through a keyboard shortcut. So if you're on a Windows machine, you're going to go up to your Edit menu to locate your preferences and select it. However, if you're on a Mac, like I am, then you're going to go up to Photoshop and you will locate Preferences here, or you can use the keyboard shortcut, which is Command or Control and the letter K. So go ahead and access your preferences, and we're going to go ahead and start going over all of these different options. And as you can see, we have a ton of different options for which to set up our Photoshop preferences. Let's start at the very top with the Generals tab. Now, this is highlighted by default and has a ton of different options already set up as the default. Personally, I like having all of these default options selected and will leave them like this for now. Each of the items here are pretty self-explanatory, and you should go through each one of them individually to see if you would prefer not to have any of them selected or to select any of the ones that are not currently selected. And if you have tooltips activated, which is by default, then if you hover over an item, you will get an explanation of what that particular item actually does. So I'm not going to go through each one of these in great detail because the information is already there for you in case you want to change something. But my recommendation is to just leave everything set at the default for now, and then at a later time, you can always come back and make adjustments as needed. All right, let's take a look at the Interface tab and see what we can do there. From here, we can select different color themes, and personally, I prefer a darker background color theme when I'm working in Photoshop. This helps me concentrate more on the file I'm working on and eliminates background distractions. That's my personal preference. If you find that a lighter color theme is better for you, then that's something that you can select here. But I find that the lighter color theme washes out the entire image and doesn't work well for my workflow. So go ahead and pick out a color theme that you think would work for you, and you can always come back here and change it later on if you decide it's not going to work for you. You also have the option to change your colors for different screen modes, as well as changing the border for drop-down shadows to lines or to none. You can also change the color theme for full screen and artboards as well. Now, another thing I want to mention real quick is, depending on your version of Photoshop, your preferences dialog box may look different than mine and may have less options. I'm currently using Photoshop CC 2018, and I know some of these recent updates have changed where some of the preference options are located. Now, down here in this section, you can change the language of the Photoshop interface as well as the font size and some other options here as well, and I just leave these at default. All right, let's check out the workspace, and as you can see, we just have a few options and they're already selected by default. Again, I personally leave these checked, and you should check them out for yourself to see if this is something you want to change for your own personal workflow. All right, next up are the tool preferences, and let's take a look at these real quick. And just like before, we have a bunch of options already set by default. Now, one of these that is not set by default that I have personally set up for myself is zoom with scroll wheel, and that's because I have a scroll wheel on my mouse and it allows me to quickly zoom in or out via that scroll wheel, and that's something that you may or may not need for yourself depending on what kind of a mouse you're using. Now, another option you may or may not need would be the show tooltips. If you're new to Photoshop, then you may want to leave this one on for now, and basically how it works is Photoshop will give you tips on a tool when you place your mouse cursor over it. So if I get out of preferences, and if I place my mouse cursor over one of the tools, not only is it going to give me the name of the tool, the keyboard shortcut for that tool, but a description of that tool as well, but it's also going to have this little image GIF up here that kind of shows you how to use the tool and gives you a visual of what's going to happen when you use that tool. Now, I think this is something new in CC 2018, and it's not available in older versions. So your tooltip may look a little bit different than this. So this is a great way to get a feel for all the tools and the associated keyboard shortcuts. But once you master Photoshop and you start using it more and more, you can go ahead and turn off the show tooltips because it can get a little distracting having these little pop-ups every time you go to grab a tool. But if you're using keyboard shortcuts, you're not going to see that anyways. Now, this next option is pretty cool. If you want to keep a history of every single thing you do to an image, you're going to want to turn on History Log. You can save every editing step you took on an image, either within the metadata of the file, a separate text file, or both. You can also choose the location if you're choosing text file, and then you can edit the log items for that particular history log, and that can include detailed, concise, or session-only information. I have detailed selected, and I have both selected. So that's entirely up to you. But either way, once you have it turned on and you have your options selected, you will then record every single step you take when you edit an image, which is pretty cool because if you save that image and then a year from now you're trying to figure out, how did I create that edit? It's so cool. I don't know how to do that again. Well, you can go back to the history log and locate that file, and Photoshop will give you step-by-step edits that you did to that particular image, and then you can recreate those edits based on those steps. I love it. It's pretty cool. All right, so our next option is file handling. Now here we can set up the option to save image previews, how you want to apply extensions, and more. Now for the file saving options, I will leave both of the image previews and append file extensions to always, and I also leave all the default options selected. Now down here we have file compatibility, and there are two options selected by default. The first one is prefer Adobe Camera Raw for supported RAW files. Now I do prefer using Adobe products, and I like having this option selected because any RAW files that I have on my computer will automatically open up in ACR. Then, if I'm saving layered TIFF files, I want Photoshop to ask me before saving it to ensure that I want a TIFF file saved versus a PSD file. Personally, I never use TIFF files and use PSD files instead, so this is one of those options that I don't have selected. Now this next one is very, very important, which is maximize PSD and PSB files. Personally, I prefer leaving it to always, but it does create a larger file. However, it ensures that I can open this file, or that my clients can open the file, in older versions of Photoshop as well as future releases. Now, if you find yourself short on hard drive space, then you can set this to never. However, you risk the chance that you will not be able to open the file in different versions of Photoshop. You can also set it up so that Photoshop will ask you if you want to maximize for a specific file. But again, doing this each time you save the file will slow down your workflow, and I just recommend leaving it on always. All right, let's go ahead and move on to export. Now, if you need to quickly export a file to another format, like PNG or a JPEG file, you can specify the default option here in exports. Now, personally, I work with a lot of images on the internet, so I prefer to have my quick export format set up as PNG, and you can change it for yourself based on your workflow and the projects that you're doing. All right, let's take a look at performance. Now, this is a very important one for an efficient workflow. So the memory usage allows you to set up the amount of RAM that Photoshop will use, and this is important because Photoshop is a RAM-intensive program. So the more RAM you allow Photoshop to use, the faster it will work. The downside is if you give it too many resources, then the rest of your computer will begin to slow down since it doesn't have the necessary RAM needed to continue to operate. So what's a good rule of thumb for the amount of RAM to dedicate to Photoshop? Well, if you remember from the first lesson in the first section of this course, we talked about the document size information down here in the bottom left. Now, this particular file, you can see the size of it right here, and this is the operational size of the file within Photoshop. So it's recommended that you have 5 to 6 times that number, and that is the amount of RAM you should have dedicated for Photoshop. At least that's the minimum recommendation. I currently have mine set up at 70% of available RAM is dedicated to Photoshop, which is more than the 5 to 6 times recommendation. Now, there are two main reasons why I have mine set so high. One, my computer is maxed out with 32 gigabytes of RAM, and there are roughly 20 gigabytes available for Photoshop. So even though I'm using 20 gigabytes for Photoshop, I still have over 10 gigabytes left for the operating system and for other programs that I run. And those 10 gigabytes are sufficient for the other programs that I use. On a typical day, I could have 3 to 5 different programs running at one time, and I find that 10 gigabytes is sufficient for the programs that I use. If I were to max out my RAM to 100% to Photoshop, then I run the chance of my operating system freezing up and having to restart the computer. Therefore, I don't really recommend going over 75% unless you have a lot of RAM available. If you're running a Windows machine or a Mac Pro that can take more than 32 gigabytes of RAM, then you could typically run this much higher as long as you have enough RAM still available for other software and for your operating system. Now, the other reason why I have so much RAM dedicated to Photoshop is the fact that I will often have several files open at one time. Plus, I do use a lot of different layers, and that's going to increase the size of the operational file. Now, right now, we just have a single image opened that is flattened with no additional layers. So the lesson is the more RAM you have, the more productive you will be and still be able to use other programs as well. So you can adjust the amount of RAM for Photoshop with this little slider down here to increase or decrease the amount of RAM. Now over here to the right, we also have an option to use a graphics processor for increased performance. Now if Photoshop has automatically detected one, it will select it by default, and I recommend leaving that as is. All right, we have one other option down here, and this is history and cache. So let's go into a little bit more detail about these as well. So as you're working on your Photoshop files, a history of your actions will be recorded and thereby allows you to go back in time to undo certain steps. So the amount of history states you set up will affect your workflow. The more history states you have selected, the slower Photoshop will work. Again, that is dependent on the amount of RAM you've selected, and the more RAM you have, the more history states you can effectively use. Now, you can go as 1,000 history states or 1,000 history steps. So every time you do something to your file, that would be considered one step. So you may be thinking that with 1,000 history states, You could do no wrong and could go back and undo anything you wanted at any time. However, every time you create a history state, Photoshop has to store that information into the RAM or your hard drive, and the more history states it has to remember and process, the slower Photoshop becomes. Unless you have an insane amount of RAM and hard drive space, I don't really recommend 1000 history states. Personally, I find 1 history states are sufficient for my projects and my workflow. You can always come back and increase this to more if you find that 100 isn't enough for your workflow and you have sufficient RAM to accommodate the extra states. You can also set the cache levels for your files as well, and this will help improve the screen redraw and histogram speed. So if you have large files with very few layers, you can select more cache levels. If you have smaller documents with many layers, then you may want to choose fewer cache levels. 6 is set by default, and that's something that I don't really change. But if you're finding that the redraw state of Photoshop is taking longer, then you may want to change your cache levels. Now, under here, we have an option called Scratch Disks, and this will give you another way to increase the efficiency of Photoshop. So these are other hard drives attached to my computer, and if I select these, I will allow Photoshop to use them as Photoshop is processing my edits. So why would you want to do that? Well, as you're working in Photoshop, Photoshop will write to your hard drive with information, just like it does with RAM, based on what you're trying to do with that file. The more intense the operation, the more Photoshop will write to your hard drive. Now, if you're only using one hard drive, and that's your operational hard drive, as it begins to fill up, Photoshop will have less and less space for which to work with, and this simply means that Photoshop will begin to get slower. So what you can do then is select another hard drive as the scratch disk. So by selecting another hard drive as your scratch disk, this will give Photoshop the ability to access more hard drive space to complete the operational task faster and thereby speeding up Photoshop. So if you do have additional hard drives connected to your computer with lots of free space, then I recommend selecting those hard drives to allow Photoshop to be much more productive for you. All right, so the next few options relate to how you can view certain aspects of Photoshop, the tools, and the interface. And the first one is cursors. You can change how the cursor looks. You can change the color of the brush preview and other things as well. For these options, I just keep the ones that are set as default. I really don't have a need to change them. I've been using them the same way forever, so there's really no need for me to change them. You can also change how the transparency of a layer looks. You can change the grid size, the grid colors, and then you can also change the gamut warning. You also have options for setting up the units for the rulers. If you don't want inches set by default, you can set something else. You can set the type. You can set the column sizes for those documents and the default settings for the resolution of your documents and the screen resolution. Typically, I find 372 work for all the type of work that I do, and I believe that is set at default, and I recommend just leaving that as is. You can also change the colors of your grids and guides if needed. Personally, I've never needed to do that, so I just leave these set as default. Plugins is a specialty type of preference setup, and we're not going to go into detail about that right now. We'll probably cover that in another section on plugins. You can also set up some different options for your type if you're going to use Photoshop for creating advertisements, flyers, and things like that. You can set up different types of options for your type, as well as 3D options. I don't really use Photoshop for 3D, but there are some options in here as well. So you're going to have to go through these individually if you're planning on doing 3D type of work in Photoshop. And then there's a couple other options here as well you're going to want to check out in case you want to use these particular features. I don't, so I'll let you take a look at those. Just hover over each one of the items and it will give you a description of what they will allow you to do. All right, we are now done with our preferences And to save all the settings that we made in our preferences dialog box here, you want to make sure you click OK to save it. Otherwise, you're going to have to start all over. So if you made any changes, go ahead and click OK. And then in the next lesson, we're going to work on our color preferences.